This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on February the 18th, 1970. The interview is conducted by Mr. Powell, Powell Woods, of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. The interviewee is Mr. Charles Hoke, Hoke, of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. This interview is being re-recorded on December the 12th, 1984 for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is Powell Woods of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. The date is February the 18th, 1970. We're in Siloam Springs, Arkansas now. Mr. Charles Edward Hoke, who now lives in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, is with me. He was born on August the 31st, 1883 in Cherokee, Kansas, which is in southeast Kansas and southeast of Pittsburgh, Kansas. Mr. Hope, can you tell us your experience of Oklahoma, sir?
My first experience in Oklahoma came when I went down with my father from Cherokee to the new claim that we had in Oklahoma Territory. And we spent 2 months down in what we later called the Quay Prairie. And during the 2 months' time that we were there, my father plowed up 40 acres of sod land, and I was 10 years old at the time, and I was large enough to help him put in part of the crop. So I put in, my duty was to put in stuff like watermelons and sorghum cane and cowpeas and lima beans and muskmelons and other crops that would mature, but in September of that fall, because the family expected to move down in September 1894, and that garden and other stuff and other crops would be ready, especially the cane patch. And the watermelons that I had planted had made wonderful growth, and the neighbors had collected in there, are coming in and getting those watermelons. There's still a lot of them when we got down there in September. Also, the sorghum cane patch was just ready to be made into sorghum, and there was a sorghum mill that the man had come in and established just about a mile east of the Hoke farm. So we harvested the sugar cane, or sorghum cane, and stripped off the leaves, cut off the seed head, and cut stalks, took to the sorghum mill, and we got half of what he made. Didn't cost anything except bring sorghum. And so we got a 50-gallon barrel full of sorghum for the first year we were there. Well, that was really the beginning. As a matter of fact, my first experience in Oklahoma had been in the spring, and when father and myself got in there, we were the only occupants of that whole territory. There wasn't another house in sight. No, we didn't have a house, but there was no establishments of any kind there, and nobody lived there. When we got there, we were the first occupants of this, what we call later the Quay Prairie. Now this Quay is not too well known in Oklahoma, but it was a little place about 20 miles east of Stillwater, and about 2 miles north, and about 4 miles northwest of the present town of Yale, and 70 miles or so west from the present town of Tulsa. Well, we stayed there 2 months, and we batched, and my father did the cooking. I was 10 years old. Didn't do much cooking, but one of my duties was to get drinking water and help him with the cooking and do this planting. So that was the very beginning of where we started in on the Quay Prairie, which has developed into quite a story later, because it was an important pioneering section. I think it was probably one of the livest, most best developed, and probably the most progressive of any pioneer section in the state, but of course others would deny that. But it was really a wonderful place for a family to grow up. The area in which we lived was called the Quay Prairie. The Quay Prairie was actually prairie, and there was good prairie grass, not the long-stemmed prairie grass, nor not like the prairie grass or in the Osage country, but it was a good type prairie grass, made good pasture and good hay. Well, that prairie was an area was about 6 miles long, about 4 miles wide, and we were just about the center of that. Probably a little bit, the Hoke family farm was just about a little bit to the west of the Quay Prairie. Well, as the Quay Prairie developed, as I said, we were the first ones in there in the spring. Now we stayed there 2 months and went back up to Kansas to the home farm where my folks had been living. They harvested their crops in Kansas, got what money they could get out of the home farm and other crops and all, and the family was ready to move then down to this new claim in September 1894. Well, we got down there. Of course, there were a lot of other people got in there by that time. We were not the only ones there. There was practically every claim in there was occupied. There was a little store that had been put in just across the road from where we built our house, and that was on, however, that was on school land, but this man had come over from Ingalls, and his name was Ellsworth. The Ellsworth family was quite noted, and especially the daughter was the wife of Bill Doolin, the famous outlaw. Well, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't brag on the Ellsworth family too much, but some of them were very nice. The old man Ellsworth was a pretty good old soul, and he was postmaster, and he said he was a preacher, but I never did hear him preach. But they were neighbors, and then we had others, as I said, over in the community. It kept coming in until it got to be a well-settled community with a family on practically every quarter section of land, or 160 acres. Well, as it developed, of course, in the community developed, we had schools, and we had churches later. We didn't have any churches there for several years. But we had the schools, though, country schools developed pretty quick. And before the country schools developed, however, we had what was known as subscription schools. That is, some individual would start a school and charge so much per youngster to go to school. First one I attended there was down at neighbor Simon Miller place about 2 miles southwest of our farm, and Mrs. Miller taught the school, and she had about a dozen pupils there, but I was the only one of the Hoke family that attended, and I never was able to understand why my folks sent me down there and didn't send the rest of the kids down. And whether they thought I needed it more than the rest, or because they thought I was probably a little smarter than the rest of them. Well, of course, we don't know about that. But actually, we did get a school in that district. There were 2 schoolhouses built there, one 2 miles away and one 2.5 miles away. Our old farm was really in the 2.5 mile distance district, and we walked 2.5 miles to school. There was no transportation at that time except walk. And we cut across country, and we could cut down, if we cut across the angles and climb wire fences and all that, and wade across the Indian allotments and across the creeks, we cut down about a half mile. Well, we didn't pay attention to that. We got up, walked up twice a day, and we had another school then that was 2 miles away, and we could cut across the fields and get there in a little under 2 miles by cutting across. Well, Brother Harry and myself I was just 1 year older than Harry. We attended both schools. If they had a good teacher at what we call the Miller Schoolhouse, which is 2.5 miles away, we would go to school there. If they had a better teacher at the Rock Schoolhouse, 2 miles away, well, we could get permit from the school board in that district to go to school over there. So we actually went to both places. Well, it took us, though, the thing about it was this, that in the country schools of that day, you couldn't complete a course. It didn't make any difference how smart a student was. That didn't enter into it. He just didn't have time to do that. So when he went back the next year, well, they started all over at the beginning. Well, Brother Harry and myself were, I was 19 and Harry was 18 when we finished 8th grade. And that particular spring, the teacher thought we were a little bit ambitious and he wanted to help us, so he suggested we take the county examination to complete the 8th grade, which we did, and we passed that. So that fall, that was in the spring of 1902. That fall, we armed with this 8th grade diploma. Well, we went over to Oklahoma Agricultural Mechanical College, now Oklahoma State College. And they thought we hadn't had any high school training. We never been inside a high school. And we had the 8th grade diploma, though, and so they put us in the preparatory department. Well, we were senior preparatory department. We didn't even have to take the junior. Put us in senior preparatory department, and we were in that 1 year, and then the college, knowing that the freshmen class coming in were not too well prepared, put in a sub-freshman class. And so you were supposed to take the sub-freshman if you hadn't had high school before you entered the freshman class. Well, we didn't do that. We finished the senior year, and then they thought we were good enough that they jumped Brother Harry and myself over the sub-freshman. We skipped that and got into freshman class. Well, of course, that was our hard luck, probably, so maybe everybody thought, but we got in there, and we didn't know anything about high school. We'd never been in a high school. Didn't know what they taught in high school. And what we found out, in this new freshman class, we had to take advanced algebra, German, and advanced English, and physics, and freehand drawing, and stuff like that. There was actually preparatory to, actually preparatory for, in some places, for the freshman class in university. But we got started though, and the professor told us at about the middle of the algebra, he says, you boys don't seem to be doing very good. I'll probably have flunk at the end of the year, end of the term, because you don't know anything about algebra. But he says, I'll help you, and if you get down and work on it, well, maybe you can make it. Well, at the end of the year, by the middle of the term, had 3 terms there then. By the middle of that fall term, why, we began to see a little bit of light. And that's when we burned the midnight oil. We had a step, that's the only time I was ever in the college that I ever burned any midnight oil, but we did that year. We studied this mathematics. We finally got so we could see what was going on. And at the end of the term, if you got 90, well, they let you out of the examination. So he let us both out of the examination. Well, we get back to Quay. Quay had very developed there as while we were gone. We had gone off to college, and another story about the college part was that when we had decided, my folks had decided to come to Oklahoma, my grandfather, who was lived in southeast Kansas near Pittsburgh, he says, Annie, he said, you don't mean to tell me you're going to take all that bunch of youngsters of yours down to Oklahoma, let them grow up in ignorance, do you? She says, yes. Boy says that's all they do, so they don't have any schools down there, don't have any churches, don't have any roads, they don't have anything down there. So they're just big ignoramuses all the way through life. Well, the peculiar part about it was that there were 10 youngsters in the Hoke family, and 8 of those youngsters graduated from the Oklahoma State College, which is a standing record now at the Oklahoma State College as we know at the present time. So that Grandpa's prediction didn't work out. But there were a lot of things about the Quay community, but I'm going to hold up a little bit now. And I know a lot of people are wondering what people lived on at that time. Well, they didn't starve. There wasn't any welfare. Nobody sat around on a chair in the front porch and watched the crowd go by. They all worked. They learned to work. If they hadn't, they would have starved to death. But my folks are not that type. When we first went down to Oklahoma, the first thing my mother asked my father to do was to lay off 1 acre for garden. And she says, I want that fence too. And I don't want any chickens and hogs and cattle or anything else in there. I want an acre. Well, he laid that off. We had very beginning, we laid off 1 acre for garden, and then in addition to that, we had about 4 acres in what would call be the 10 acre home site that we devoted to crops like sweet potatoes and sweet corn and Irish potatoes and peanuts and watermelons and cantaloupes, and we didn't even put sorghum cane on it. We put that in the field. But we had all those crops. There was about 5 acres that we devoted particularly to these garden crops and fruit crops. On those 4 acres, they put in trees, fruit trees, and while they were small, they could garden, you see, in between. Peaches and apples and plums and cherries, and then they had grapes, gooseberries, and that would be the most of our fruits at that time. I don't believe we had any pears. We didn't, for some reason or other, we didn't like pears, I guess, but we had all the other common fruits. Well, and the fruit crops, though, the peaches would develop in a few years' time. You'd get a crop, and as your fruit crops and your garden crops every year, and with canning activities, women at that time didn't buy cans out of the store. They put up their own stuff. So they canned tomatoes and fruits of all kinds. And if we didn't have enough on home place, we nature provided around that area, with such things as wild plums and not wild cherries because they weren't any good. But wild grapes, kids like we had a bunch of kids that roamed up and down the one section not too far from where we lived, and we'd find persimmons. That's where I developed a liking for persimmons. We thought that was wonderful if we could get out with a bunch of boys, and go up and down this slough with a shotgun. We could shoot rabbits and maybe a quail once in a while, and we could find wild grapes. We could stop and eat wild grapes, or black haws, or red haws, or get any other kind of plums, anything. Country kid will eat anything. Doesn't make any difference. He'll try it, I mean. Sometimes, like wild cherries, we don't try it the second time. But it was wonderful. That, of course, was part of the country boy experience. Well, we had in the community now, don't think it wasn't a live community. I really think that the Quay community had the most developed, the highest developed sporting of any section in the state. I don't mean they're professionals, they were not. But we had baseball, and we had horse races, we had foot races, and of course they had the smaller games like croquet and stuff like that. If you didn't want to do some of the tougher stuff, you played croquet or pitched horseshoes. We had all that kind of stuff. Well, we had two baseball teams at Quay. One of them was what we called the senior team, one the junior team, and I was manager and pitcher for the kid team. And we had, now you'd be surprised that we didn't have professionals in the community, but we did have several men who had played professional. I mean, we didn't have a professional team, but we had several men in the community that had played professional baseball during their careers, and they very kindly offered their services, and they organized a team at Quay, and they played on it. So we played at places like Pawnee and Jennings and Cushing, and then other country teams would be organized. We played those. Always had some game going on, and teams would be off someplace on Saturdays. They usually played that on Saturdays. And then we had horse races. And one time I remember particularly about the baseball. We played, this the senior team played a baseball team from down in the present vicinity of Yale. They had a baseball team, and they were called the Spencer Nine. The Spencer boys were great big fellows, were over 200 pounds and better, and they had cedars down that area, so they made baseball bats out of cedar limbs. And they came up to Quay one time to play ball, and well, first though the Quay team went down there, and they each team furnished the bats. Well, and this time, well, the Spencer furnished the big cedar limb bats, and our boys couldn't handle them. They're just too heavy; couldn't even get them up to hit the ball. So they just beat the life out of the Quay team that day. Well, and when they came back, came up to Quay, the boys knew a little bit more about that. They had the regular bats, and Spencer's didn't know how to handle the regular bats. They never seen one of them. So we beat them that time. But the funniest baseball experience. So we had a man in the community we called Rattlesnake Bill. And Rattlesnake Bill was, they said he was about half crazy, but he probably was at least half, maybe a little more. But he was a snake charmer too. He lived out west of Quay in the limestone hills, and he'd catch rattlesnakes and bring them up, put them in a flour sack and tie them to the cantle of his saddle and bring them into Quay, and then he sold those snakes someplace. We never did know, but he sold them to some outfit that took those snakes and got. They had their teeth. Now, don't think he pulled their fangs, because they'd have been worthless if he'd have pulled their fangs. Because they wanted the poison out of those snake fangs as I guess, probably to cure other rattlesnake bites or something. In other words, it was a medicine. Well, one time he came up to Quay and he had one of those big rattlesnakes in his sack, and he decided to have a little fun. There was a pretty good crowd in town that day, gathered in there on Saturday, and he turned one of those big rattlesnakes loose out in the street. Well, he just followed him around, and the old snake would obey him, and go to where he asked him to go, but the crowd kept getting back, until they were afraid the old snake wouldn't obey this sorry, and so he finally had his fun out. So he went over and picked up his snake. He stuck him in the sack. That show was over. But this same hour, what I started to tell was this: that the Pawnee Indians at Pawnee had an Indian team, Indian baseball team, and the Pawnee Indians were pretty good baseball players. They could run, and actually they were not bad team. So the first time the Quay team played them, they got badly beaten by the Pawnee Indians. Well, the Pawnee Indians then came down to Quay, and our boys had learned something. An Indian is a little bit superstitious, and he's afraid of evil spirits. And so it came down, and we had this Ari. The manager put Ari in to pitch. Well, as he stood out the pitcher's box, and the first Indian got up and held his bat out, and everything was ready, why Ari wound up and rolled his eyes around at the same time, and the Indian at the bat could see the whites of his eyes, and he thought the evil spirit was in there. So he steps back a little bit, and he didn't even look to see the ball. Ari was a terrific thrower, so he missed that ball. But he fanned out. He just fanned out. He couldn't hit anything. Went back to Bunch and says, "Me afraid that fellow there said he's got evil spirits in him. Me not going to hit anymore." So he didn't, and that time the Quay boys beat him pretty badly. But so Ari had quite a reputation as a pitcher. Well, we had a kid team too. They played around Jennings and other places, and they didn't know anything much about playing. They never had seen a curved ball. We didn't know what a curved ball was. But one time we played a Jennings team, and they had an Indian boy who was a pretty good pitcher, and he could throw an out curve. And when he showed this out curve, we'd see that ball coming in, and we'd think we could hit that ball pretty good, and we'd hit it, we'd miss it about a foot because curve out just got the bat. Well, we found out about that. Kids are not dumb. And the next time we played Jennings, one of these old professionals had told us. He says, you can't pitch anything but a curved outside curve, out curve. He says, you watch it. If it looks like it's going to hit you, well, you hit at it. He says, you sure hit it. He says, you've got to know what to do about that kind of a ball. So that's all he can throw. So you just learn where to stand when it's going to curve out. Well, you learn that. So we just knocked it all over the Jennings field and beat him about 4-0. Well, that was one of the things that they didn't like for amusement in those days. Quay, as I said, was quite an amusement sports center. They had foot races. There was one big old boy that we called him Big Tom, Negro, lived in the Negro colony about 7 or 8 miles northeast or northwest of Quay. Big Tom would come down there on Saturday afternoons. I believe he was the fastest man Oklahoma ever developed. But he was a Negro, and of course, he couldn't get in the white schools. But he had ambition. He wanted to be a doctor. And he, in spite of all the handicaps that the races had, Tom didn't allow handicaps to bother him. He went on off to school someplace and got to be a doctor. But that was just part of it. We had the horse races, and every Saturday we had something: baseball, horse races in the summer. This would be in the summertime. We had one case there where in horse racing, we had as I said, horse racing nearly every Saturday, and you never knew about those race horses. Some of them were good, some of them not, but they furnished a lot of entertainment. One time, though, there was a regular racing horse came through there, and possibly down the racing tracks down Fort Worth, somewhere down there. And this fellow thought he'd make a little money on the Quay community, so he said his horse could outrace anything in the community. So had one old Powell horse there that'd been doing some racing, and nobody knew how fast he was. He'd appeared in the community or so, or in the community development. Nobody knew how fast he was because he never had really been tried out. Every time he'd run a race, he'd won it. So they finally got him matched with this regular racehorse, and they ran 1.25 miles. They built a special track out there on the prairie for that. Ran 1.25 miles. And this old prince, he got a little bit excited, and the racehorse, in fact, we didn't know whether he'd last 1.25 miles or not. So they got a little bit excited, and but the old prince got excited too. But as he came down the track, he got about halfway through, and the racehorse was ahead. Old prince looked around. He saw this other horse race, he saw this other animal ahead of him. So that made him mad. And you know what he did? He put on a burst of speed. And he went down that track as fast as he could go, and was pretty fast. As I said, if he'd been going that rate in a few minutes more, he'd been up Pawnee, 17 miles away. But he beat that racehorse. So the next day, the racehorse man left Quay without any of Quay's money. Well, that's just one incident in that. We haven't said anything about the Outlaws, of course. And I'll rest a little bit before I tell you about the Outlaws. I forgot something about the race, and that was the minister. We didn't know. My folks that time didn't belong to church. Most people didn't, because we hadn't had any churches there. But in this case, this is a Methodist church, Methodist minister, and we didn't know what attitude he'd take towards horse racing, and especially whether he would be a bet or anything. Of course, we didn't think he would, but after the horse race was over, and this old prince had won the race so bad, especially whether he would be a bet or anything. Of course, we didn't think he would, but after the horse race was over, and this old prince had won the race so badly, why, everybody's surprised that the next Sunday his wife had a new hat. So we wondered where she got the money for that. Well, back these other things, that was another thing that developed in that community was feuds and fighting. We don't talk about fighting much, but we had a little Missourian in that section. He was mean, he was stinking, and he ornery. but he had a family, and he was not too big, but he was a fighter, and he was uh, I mean, he wasn't honest. He wasn't what you call an honest fighter. He'd wait until he got an opportunity to get somebody mad, and before the other fellow knew he was going to hit him, or he haul off and hit him, and he could hit like a mule could kick. And he'd knock him down, and he'd get on him and stomp him with his feet, and the fight was over. Well, one great big old boy there we called Bill Cox said he's telling my father about it, and about one fight he had with him. Well, he said, Mr. Hoke said we were sitting at the card table, and said, I didn't know Buford was mad. He said, we were just playing cards, and finally he said he just got up and he hit me a terrible lick on my jaw, and he said I went down on the floor, and he says I couldn't do anything. I was a whole lot bigger than he was, but he was on top of him and kicking him in the face and everything. He said, just look at my face while it's all bruised up. Said he just kicked me. Well, that was Buford had a reputation in that area as a fighter. Nobody had ever whipped him. So he said. So when after Yale developed, they had a saloon down there, and we had a doctor in the community, Dr. Smith, had a bunch of boys, and this older boy was kind of sassy type, not very big, but besides Buford, but he was what we call a little bit feisty. Well, they met at the saloon down at Yale one day. Of course, not everybody went in the saloon. Quay didn't have a saloon, by the way, at that time. But this doctor's son was standing at the bar, so the man that told me about it later, it said, and he saw Buford coming up behind him, and he knew what was going to happen because Buford had threatened to give him a licking. So about the time Buford got up where he could draw back his fist, this Ernie threw a glass of beer in his face, and that started it. Buford didn't get in the first lick, and he never did get in any lick. Well, they fought, and finally they chewed each other's toes and chewed ears, and spit, and Buford spit tobacco juice in Ernie's eyes, or tried to, and Ernie got his fingers behind Buford's ears in the lower part. You better not try that either. In the lower part, and he was putting on the pressure. That's what his doctor father taught him. Well, that was one of the pressure points, and he'd have killed Buford if they'd left him alone. But Buford yelled out and told the referee. They had a man in the saloon doing the referee. He said he's going to kill him. He's going to kill me. I can feel it. So they separated him. Well, they called it a draw, but Buford quit fighting. He never did fight another. As far as I know, he never did fight another fight. Well, then that of course these fights were not entertainment for the entire community, but in the way of entertainment for the community, we had a lot of things we didn't lack for entertainment. We had these box suppers, where your best girl took her box, and by some means or other, she let her best boyfriend know which was her box. He wasn't supposed to, but he found out, so he would bid on her box, of course, get her box. Well, of course, that was one entertainment. We had a country dance, square dance, and they were entertaining. We had a little orchestra in the community there that played those old-time tunes, like Turk in the Straw and what are some of the others. These dances are really entertaining for a number of years, but there was no drinking, no fighting, or rough stuff at these dances when they first began. But in later years, the country dances got to be a place of rowdyism. There was a lot of drinking and fights and all that, and they gradually died out. But, of course, we had these other entertainments. We had the regular parties. At that time, the popular party was the taffy pulling party. and that taffy was made out of sorghum molasses and boiled to make taffy, and then of course they took that as it came off a stove, and they had to pull it. The big joke was if you didn't had a couple, they'd pair off in couples, and big joke was if you didn't give them put any grease on your hands, they'd stick to your hands. So always had some joke on somebody because that taffy would stick to their hands. And of course the girls got a little bit of that taffy in their hair, which was incidental. But it really was a lot of fun, and they got taffy as you pulled it, would get pretty light, and sorghum molasses candy wasn't bad, kind of like sorghum molasses cake. I wouldn't mind having some of that now. That was a really good cake. Well, sorghum molasses is all right in this place. I don't eat them anymore, but in other words, I grew up on sorghum molasses, so that's off my diet. The same as rhubarb, for instance. But these parties, though, we had games, and outdoors we played things like the old-time drop the handkerchief and games of that kind, or crack the whip, even with the girls on the team, and we had black man, and inside we had some of the guessing games and heavy hangs over your head and so forth. But we had a good time. It's always nice, and of course a lot of romances started at those parties. Of course, I didn't catch the romance. I got off to college too soon. I mean, I didn't catch anything in the Quay neighborhood, but a lot of boys did. And a lot of romance developed in schools. We had in schools there. We had a regular school, and then through the week up till Friday. And Friday afternoon, we always had after last recess, we would have either spelling matches or ciphering matches or declamations, and sometimes a little dialogue and things like that for entertainment after the last recess on Friday. Well, the same way at the Literary Society. That was on Saturday night always through the winter time, and we started that out with the recitations and songs, and we had two fellows there in the neighborhood that we didn't know anything about their history. You don't know anything about that. You don't ask anything about that. You don't go into anybody's history in a new community, So we never did know, but the old man Tulloch could get up on the platform, and recite Shakespeare, just like I've heard those Shakespearean scholars later on. He just about as good as they were. Another fellow named Joe Motter, he could recite Shakespeare too. And another boy we had there could read. He was a good reader. And his favorite, of course, the Darius Green, his flying machine, was in a long poem, and this boy would read part of that poem every night for a long time because it'd take him. He couldn't read all of it at one time. But Darius Green, his flying machine, and old Darius says, if birds can fly, why can't I? So he tried that. He made a flying machine. He jumped out of the barn loft with his machine and flopped on the ground. And of course, that was the funniest thing I think we ever had in the Literary Society, was to have him listen to that Darius Green and his flying machine, and to figure, well, big nut, he would know nobody can ever fly. 15 years later, the Wright brothers flew the first flight, just about 15 years later from that. And nobody ever even dreamed that they'd ever get a flying machine in the air. Well, we had a literary paper. That literary paper would cite things, that happened in the neighborhood, or so they said. But, of course, they dwelt more or less upon love affairs in the community, about so-and-so's buggy had been seen standing in front of Murray Brown's house, for instance, and wondered why it was out there, and things like that. But that old literary paper was the most interesting thing in the Literary Society. Well, I had debates. One time we had the old subject up there about which had been treated the worst by the United States, the Indian or the Negro, and they debated that. And you know the funniest thing though, the Negroes I know now think that white people never loved them, but you know the funniest thing and the most interesting thing in the old literary society was a Negro, what we called a Negro play. And we didn't have any Negroes in the Quay community. There were none in there. There were none in the immediate community, but they were black up. And one time they had a play there where Uncle Tom or some blacked up as a Negro had stolen, or so they said. Now there's a charge against him. This was a trial that night. So he said Uncle Tom was arrested for stealing a watch. So they had witnesses on each side, and they had attorneys on each side, and the judge was to decide the case, and they went all through that. That was, of course, the crowd getting a big kick out of that because they liked that. And they finished the trial, and they got all the evidence in, and the old judge says, he said to the Negro, he said, I'm going to decide you're not guilty. He says, I don't believe the evidence would show you were guilty. Well, it seemed to me that the evidence showed he'd taken the watch out of the other fellow's pocket, and the judge didn't see him do it, of course, but he did do it. And so Negro looked up and he said, Judge, he said, does that mean I has to give up the watch? Well, that was just one of those plays, you know. We had a literary society. There were two literary societies in this community. Most every winter, one over at what we call the Jones Schoolhouse and one they called the Miller Schoolhouse. And people went there. They just packed those schoolhouses, you know. But that was one form of entertainment. First, the entertainment of declamations and songs and recitations and that, and then the second part would be the debate and probable play. Not always a play, but often a play, like in the popular ones I said was the Negro play. Well, those are some of the things, of course, in the entertainment. School had really started that. One thing I remember more about the country school than anything else was the last day of school. I was just old enough to appreciate that because I was just growing up, you know, and I was only 10 when I went down to Oklahoma. But only that in that few years there. But I saw we from 10 to 15, 16. But they always had a dinner. Had a dinner, you know. They spread out. They'd put boards on the school seats and spread out, you know, like stuff and pies and cakes and fried chicken and ham and all each, you know, you could think about. And every kid in that schoolhouse, their school district, stuffed himself on that last day of school. And that was really a popular day. But now, of course, there was one old country school disappeared. They finally got in the Quay district. They eliminated the old country school, and there was a consolidated school. Started at Quay, the first one in the state. Very first consolidated school in Oklahoma was at Quay, and they ran wagons out. Had seats in these kind of wagon bus affair, except they had team horses pulled a bus. But they ran it out several miles in the country and brought those kids in from way out in the country, and that was the first consolidated school. Later then, Quay put up a high school, and they had a high school at Quay then until just the last few years. I think 2 years ago, the Quay school closed. But that was after the oil development in the Quay community. One thing that killed the Quay community, and was the fact that the oil field kept moving closer and closer. It first got oil up at Bartlesville. First oil well in the state, I believe, was at Bartlesville. The Bartlesville sand. Then they moved down a little bit closer. And finally they drilled around Cushing, east of Cushing, and they got oil. And they drilled at Drumright and some of those other places in there close to Drumright. Got oil there, Oilton. And then they came over far closer to Cushing, and finally they started a well. The geologists had come into the Quay neighborhood, and they had decided that there was oil in the Quay section, and that was survey was made by state geologist and Frank Buttram. Frank was later quite prominent at Oklahoma City. Well, Frank was this young guy getting out of the university down at Norman, and O'Hearn was state geologist, and they made the survey, what they call a geological survey, in the Quay area. Well, we, of course, nobody knew anything about that, but my father always maintained that ever since he'd had that place, that someday they would find 1 million barrels of oil under his land. He said that he was sure they would find 1 million barrels of oil under the Hoke farm. Well, they drilled the first well a mile south. It was only about a 50-barrel well. Everybody was disappointed. Then they moved up a half mile north of that on the Jones 80, and they got 500 barrels per day. Well, then they moved up and started a well on one corner of the Hoke farm. Well, I was in Washington at that time. I was working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I was in Washington and went over to the Congressional Library to read the papers one day, and I noticed that the Hoke well had run into water. Well, that was a pretty bad blow. Didn't know there was any oil in it or not. So I went back to Oklahoma City that time pretty badly disappointed, and I knew my folks were. But in January now in 1917, they hit oil. My father was down the well that night, and he talked to drillers that working on it, and they said he heard a noise. And he says, "You hear that noise, Mr. Hoke?" He says, "Yes. What is it?" Well, he says it isn't gas. And about a few minutes later, the oil came up out of that well and went scooting way up over the top. The only gusher they ever let flow on the Hoke farm. Then they began to drill. And the peculiar part of my father's prophecy was that after they drilled 16 wells on the Hoke farm, and one of them a producer, one of them made 2,000 barrels a day, and no proration at that time. The last report that I have heard on the Hoke farm Oklahoma oil history, that the Hoke farm was one of the 4 richest farms in the state, that it had produced upward of 4 million barrels of oil under that 160 acres, which is probably one of the records in Oklahoma. Well, the old Quay territory now, in spite of all that, as I said, was a live neighborhood. Farming was good. My father was a good farmer. I know, go back to the days when we had something to eat. We didn't starve. I know people wondered what in the world those pioneers lived on. They go down there and they couldn't imagine that they could go into Oklahoma, which is a raw territory, prairie, that they could go in there and go back and put in a crop, go back in the fall and have anything to eat that winter. But the Hoke family never starved at any time. There never was any time that we ever didn't have plenty on our table, and that was because my folks were food conscious. They knew they were both good. My mother was a good gardener. My father was a good farmer out in the field. and they knew what to plant and what to do to feed a big family. So as I said, we never did starve. We weren't on any. There wasn't anything like welfare. As I said, we didn't know. In fact, somebody said we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor. Most pioneers didn't know that. They hadn't been classified then by the government, you see, and they didn't know they were poor, so they got along all right. And but we had things to eat. What neighbors did too. They maybe not quite as ambitious in gardening and farming as they might be, but they made a living. And so my folks followed a plan of food production. They got three economic principles: simple, food, clothing, and shelter. Well, we didn't produce the clothing, but we produced cotton, which bought the clothing. Produced hogs and young colts and farm products of different kinds that bought the clothing. So we lived, as I said, we had no particular trouble. We always had clothes. We always had shoes. We went barefoot in the summer. And the kids, you know, if you ever lived in the country, you know the first thing you do in the spring is get your shoes off. You're really not living till you get your shoes off and throw them in the back in the closet until the cold weather comes on again. We went every place barefooted, even up in the woods, you know, and along the slough and all those places. We went barefooted. I haven't said anything about the outlaws in the Quay territory. We didn't have outlaws actually right in the territory, but the outlaws rode through there. Old creek country. You see, we were in the old Oklahoma section before statehood, and then just east of us was the Indian Territory section before statehood. Well, the outlaw gangs really arbored at places in the Indian Territory section, particularly in the creek country, what we called it, just the east of Quay, only about 7 or 8 miles. So the outlaws that ride out of the creek country and ride across the Quay Prairie and get over into Oklahoma someplace, or even up into southern Kansas and rob trains or banks and come down through the Quay territory and get into the creek country where the officers couldn't catch them. Well, of course, one of these, go back to Dalton Gang. Everybody heard about the Dalton Gang. Now, the Dalton Gang was not active at the time my family moved down to Quay. The Daltons had made a raid at Coffeyville in the fall of '93, I believe it was, and my family moved down in the fall of '94, and that raid the Daltons were wiped out. The story about the Dalton brothers is that they did roam that territory. There was a Dalton cave about a mile or so north of Quay. I noticed recently some so-called historian refers to it as the Doolin Cave. There never was a Doolin Cave in that area. It was a Dalton Cave, and he just didn't know his history. But the Daltons, though, a year before we moved to Oklahoma, had made this raid at Coffeyville, and there was about 6 in the gang, and they rode into Coffeyville one morning expecting to rob 2 banks. So they rode down the street in plain daylight, talking, you know, and laughing and all that, till as they went down into town, got out of town, they got divided. There were 2 banks in Coffeyville. The gang divided, and the Daltons went to one bank. 2 of them went in. The other Dalton held the horses outside. Then there were 2 more men that went to the outlaws that went to the other bank, and they had 6 men, but the 6th man they sent around to come in from town from another way. So he didn't get into the fight. he came in close enough to hear the shootings. He turned around and beat back to Oklahoma. But the Daltons are two of the Daltons were killed, right, both in the bank. They were killed. Emmett Dalton outside holding the horses was badly wounded, captured and sent to the penitentiary. Teddy Roosevelt pardoned him later, but they said he made a pretty good citizen later. But the other two men went into the other bank. One of them was killed in the bank. The other was killed as he got on his horse and rode out of town, or rather he had been wounded and dropped off his horse. And they found him dead out the edge of town. Well, that was the Dalton boys. Well, Bill Doolin was one of the outlaws at that time, and Bill was actually a member of the Dalton Gang, but had not been in the Dalton raid, He was not in the Dalton raid on Coffeyville. Why, we don't know. Some said he was because he was afraid. I think it was because Bill was just a little bit too smart. He didn't like Bob Dalton in the first place, and he thought Bob was crazy to make any effort to rob two banks at one time. But anyway, he said he was sick and he stayed out. But Doolin then organized his own gang, and he was the one really that we knew best in the home Quay neighborhood. Doolin's gang harbored over at Ingalls, a good part of the time a little town in between, just east of Stillwater, present town of Stillwater, and the present town of Yale, Ingalls. They harbored there quite a bit, and that's where this Ellsworth family that came over to Quay and put in the first store originated. That's the first we knew about them. They came from over there. Well, the daughter, Edith Ellsworth, had married Bill Doolin. So, but Bill never did live in our neighborhood, but Edith would come there once in a while and visit her folks, so we knew her well, but we didn't know Bill Doolin. He never showed to her at any time he was on Earth run. Well, finally captured Bill Doolin over Eureka Springs. Bill Tillman captured him, brought him back to Guthrie and put him in the federal jail, and he'd been in there only a month or so. He and another fellow overpowered the jailer and got out and released everybody else in the federal jail at Guthrie. Well, Bill got out and they heard a horse, so one of these historians said horse popped him down the street on the icy pavement. I don't know where he got the icy pavement because it's in July. But anyway, that was his story about the Bill Doolin killing. So I'm probably one of the few. In fact, I don't know of anybody else that's living at this time that knows the true story of Bill Doolin. How he was killed, where he was killed, and when. But Bill Doolin was killed one night. He got out of jail at Guthrie. He came up. His wife then, Edith Ellsworth, was across the road from where we lived. She had appeared there, but Bill got out of jail and he came up to the house. He'd come up there at night, then he'd go back to the woods in the daytime. Well, they found out his movements, so they organized a posse and waylaid him down about 200 miles west of our farmhouse. The officers hid in the cane patch, and Bill came down the road leading his horse and carrying a Winchester. He got down opposite the posse, and they called on him to halt, and he didn't halt. He shot. He shot with his Winchester first, and then, but they dropped him. They shot him. There was nine men in the posse, and some of them had rifles and some shotguns. Probably the one that had shotgun shot him with buckshot because his pictures later show his breast is full of buckshot holes. Well, he dropped dead right there. He's killed instantly. And so his wife Edith across the street had told him not to go down that road. Says, the officers are going to be down there waiting for you. Oh, he says, I don't care. He said, just the Noble brothers down there. He said, I'll shoot once and they'll run. But he forgot that Heck Thomas was down there. Heck Thomas was one of the well-known outlaw hunters, and he didn't run. And in fact, none of them ran, so he was killed instantly. Well, Heck Thomas came up to our house early in the evening, and he said, Mr. Hoke, we want to get your team to take this Bill Doolan's body down to Guthrie. He says, I don't want to get mixed up in that, Heck. Well, I said, that doesn't make any difference what you say about it. Says, you go get that team. Said, we want it. And he said, if I have to, I'll deputize you. So one fellow, they went out and rounded up a team, and they took, I guess they had to take wood off the wagon to get their wagon bed, put the wagon bed back on. Well, anyway, they drove down there, and the father went down with them, and of course, Bill Doolan was lying there dead. They picked him up and threw him in the wagon just like with a dead hog, and the officers got in the wagon, sat around on the edges, and off they went to Guthrie with driving our mule team, and our farm dog went along too. He went down to Guthrie. Well, a few days later, they brought the team back, and my father, they paid him $10 for the use of his team. The rest of the posse, they thought they were going to get a lot of money out of Bill Doolan's death. Of course, there'd been a big, heavy reward offered for him, but when they collected the award, the officers actually got 9 men, I think, got probably an average not over $50 apiece. That's all they ever got out of the killing. And the other companies, like the big express companies, the banks, went back on their agreements and didn't pay anything. In other words, they went back on their agreement. They got him dead, and they were satisfied, so they didn't have to pay. Of course, they take him dead or alive. That was what that was the agreement, you know. But we had 2 men in our community there, 2 blacksmiths, the Noble brothers are talking about, Tom and Bill, Charlie. Bill was in the posse, but he was down on a farm away from there. The 2 blacksmiths, so Tom and Charlie, I believe they got $50 apiece. And that's all they ever got out of the killing of Bill Doolan. So the prize they didn't amount to anything, but they pulled a reward on him. Well, this mentioned, of course, we had other outlaw doings in the state. In the neighborhood, there was two families really down southeast of the present town of Yale, and they had incurred the enmity of a bunch of outlaws over in the Creek country. And the old judge, they'd been down, these outlaws had been warned by Judge Parker at Fort Smith, the hanging judge, and they knew if they went down there with the proper witnesses, the old judge would hang them, because they were guilty and these folks knew it.